This week we are covering developmental theories, also known as crime and the life course. Developmental theories are also known as life course criminology. As you know, for years, criminologists focused on teenagers when explaining criminal offending. And here's why. This is a very rough estimate of the age crime curve. So the blue line represents property crimes, the red line represents violent crimes, and the green line represents average crimes, the average of both the property and the violent. When you plot age and crime, this is what it looks like. So as you can see, most crime is occurring around adolescence. If you look at property crime, you can see that there's a very high peak in the earlier years, and then you can see the violent crime peak is significantly later. But you have most of the crime really occurring between about, 13 and 25. And you see this really steep decline that occurs by the late 20s, early 30s. And so they believed then that crime was really a teen problem. Now, when we started to implement longitudinal studies, which is when we follow individuals over a period of time, we were able to see the same pattern, but we saw a significant amount of desistance. And so criminologists set out to explain the onset of offending, the persistence of offending, and desistance of offending. So onset, when crime begins. Persistence is how long does the criminal behavior continue. And desistance is when offending stops. So criminologists wanted to understand if the same factors can explain onset of offending and desistance of offending and persistence of offending. And this is how developmental or life course criminology emerged. So there are 3 types of criminological theories that fall within developmental theory. Some criminological theories argue in continuity of offending. So if you go back to the age crime curve, they would argue that individuals, as you can see, it never gets to 0, never stop offending. And so there is some stability in criminal offending over a life course. Those individuals tend to indicate that the incidence of offending can explain this dip in crime, that people begin to commit fewer crimes. They still commit crime, but just fewer of them. Then you have those theories that are continuity and change. Continuity and change theorists argue that crime continues, but eventually everyone has the opportunity to change and desist. Some individuals, however, have reduced opportunities and rarely desist, but for the most part, every offender has a chance to desist from offending. So they describe the drop in the age crime curve as a result of prevalence. So fewer people begin to commit crime. So prevalence has to do with people committing crimes, the amount of people, and incidence has to do with the amount of crimes being committed. Then you have theories that look at continuity or change. These theorists explain that some people continue, others change. So the first theory we're talking about is Gottfredson and Hirschi's theory. We're going back to a general theory of crime, which remember is a control theory, where the main cause of crime is this characteristic of low self-control. So this is a little bit different from the graphic that you saw on the control theory, because here it's talking about when parenting is actually ineffective. So when parenting is ineffective, they fail to supervise and monitor the child, they fail to identify bad or deviant behavior, and they fail to effectively punish the behavior. When that happens, low self-control is formed in that child. That child then is impulsive, insensitive, physical, a risk taker, short-sighted, and nonverbal. And if you remember, low self-control is set by the age of 10, and Gottfredson and Hirschi claimed that this was stable, right? So this is continuity and offending, that this particular trait was stable throughout an individual's life course. And so being stable, set by 10, this low self-control characteristic leads to delinquent behavior when they're young, criminal behavior when they're old, and a series of analogous behaviors. They describe how very early in life you will actually see the effects of low self-control. As young as 6 or 7, the kid will be talking back, pushing, shoving, have poor performance, constantly getting in trouble in school. And then as they hit early adolescence, they continue having issues in school, and then you see them engaging in minor delinquent behavior. So shoplifting, vandalism, skipping school. In late adolescence, they are constantly skipping school. Some of them drop out of school. They hang out with many more delinquent peers. They start using drugs and alcohol. And you see them involved in much more crime. In adulthood, they have failed marriages, no marriages, they're unemployed, they're poor, and they engage in more serious crime. So what you see is the same problems that the individual had as a child, they also have as a teen and then as an adult. And this is persistent heterogeneity, that low self-control is a stable underlying individual difference that people carry with them across situations at any one time throughout their life course. So if this behavior is stable, then how do Gottfredson and Hirschi et al. Describe this significant dip in offending, in the late 20s? Well, Gottfredson and Hirschi, if you remember, if you go back to their chart, they explain that analogous behaviors are really no different from criminal behaviors. So this characteristic of low self-control not only explains criminal offending or delinquent offending, but it also explains not wearing a seatbelt or engaging in skydiving or engaging in other risky behaviors. So Gottfredson and Hirschi says that this dip in the age crime curve is explained by incidents of offending. They're not actually desisting, they're committing fewer crimes, and they're probably engaging in much more analogous behaviors. So just to review, Gottfredson and Hirschi argue in a continuity in offending. They describe that the incidence of offending decreases, that onset and persistence and even desistance can all be explained by low self-control. They begin because of low self-control, they continue because of low self-control, and it only appears that they desist because they are engaging in other risky behaviors due to their low self-control. So the next theorist we'll talk about is continuity and change.